The third matter relates to the defence of Australia, and that defence has always been guided by a defence of our Judeo-Christian values. It has to be remembered that Australia was founded at about the same time as there was being created in Europe an atheistic ideology which was to guide the French Revolution, which was to drive Europe into a reign of terror, into a war that spread across Europe. And of course that movement was eventually to give birth to Marxism. Marxism, which had as its objects for destruction private property, the family, religion, and even the state. That movement was born in Australia during the First World War. By the time of the end of the Second World War, it had maintained and developed a dominance in the trade union area, so much that the majority of the Australian Council for Trade Unions was under the control of an alien, foreign, atheistic ideology. And two men at the end of the Second World War came forward to defend Australia. One was the Prime Minister, Robert Gordon Menzies. The other was B.A. Santamaria. B.A. Santamaria, who was to lead the movement for the removal of communism from the trade unions, and effectively to achieve that. In about that period, or soon after, particularly under the Whitlam government, we saw that agenda being developed again by a minister, an Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, who, as John Howard says in his recent memoirs, seemed to have a barely concealed contempt about the Judeo-Christian ethic, and as Manning Clark was to admit, had an agenda to remove it from the Australian fabric. John Howard says in his memoirs that the family law bill, which was introduced under that government, the Whitlam government, the family law bill was a bite-sized chunk towards achieving that agenda, because it had such a deleterious effect on the Australian family. Even the innocuous introduction of marriage celebrants has had that result too. Nowadays, more than half of marriages are celebrated out of church by secular marriage celebrants, who have now moved into the naming of children in a ceremony which mimics, but which is not, the sacrament of baptism. Yet another blow against the Judeo-Christian ethic of our society. Even when he was on the High Court, Lionel Murphy was to take part in a case in 1983 which found an organisation which is patently not a church, Scientology, to be a church. And I have no doubt that on his part, this was part and parcel of an agenda to make it so difficult for the government to continue to grant taxation concessions to the churches, because Scientology is obviously not a church, that eventually governments would withdraw the concession from the churches, which would greatly achieve part and parcel of the Murphy agenda. This is something which will continue. There will always be a challenge against our Judeo-Christian ethic, and the fact that there is a challenge does not in any way mean that Christianity is not relevant. We now have an attempt, for example, to say that marriage is not what was believed at the time of Federation, and believed for so long, a relationship between a man and a woman for the procreation of children. We have moves to take away the fundamental agreement for public education in New South Wales, when the Protestant schools handed over their schools to the state on condition that Scripture and Scripture only be taught in exclusive periods in the schools. Now there's an attempt to introduce a competitive system of so-called ethics, which are in many ways, I think, designed to ensure that there will be a movement away from Scripture, so that the small amount of exposure that children have to religion will be minimized. As one of our participants recently said, what sort of Scripture will be taught? Because there are so many, or what sort of ethics will be taught? Because there are so many brands of ethics. The fact is that, as Burke said, society is a contract. It's a contract between those living today, those who've gone before us, and those yet to be born. And it is the duty and the honour of those of us alive today to continue the struggle to maintain in our society a society which is based on Judeo-Christian ethics, the ethics which were those of the people who founded this country. They were the values, the Judeo-Christian values, which were at the base of the institutions under which this country was founded and under which this country thrived. And they are the institutions which will guide this country for the future.